I'm now 18 days into Czech on Duolingo, and I'm starting to see how case works. I'm not particularly surprised to learn that Czech has case because I know that Slavic languages typically do. I don't actually speak any other Slavic languages, but I'm a grad student in linguistics, so I've learned all kinds of fun trivia about different languages and language families. I've also studied German, which has case, although in German it's marked on the determiner instead of the noun. So when Duolingo started giving me sentences with accusative case, I was able to identify it pretty quickly, even before I got to the unit actually titled Use the Accusative. I'm pretty sure that in addition to accusative case, Czech also has vocative, which is a type of case used for direct address. In examples like these, there's definitely a different suffix on the names, which isn't the same as the one for the accusative. With that being the case, I'm expecting to find a lot of other cases. Vocative is very low in the case hierarchy. What that means is that not all cases are equally likely to show up in a given language. Some have none, or essentially none, like English, which has case for pronouns but not for nouns. Some have just a few, and some have a huge number. But typically, if a language has two cases, they'll be either nominative and accusative or ergative and absolutive. The difference between those two systems is a whole other topic that isn't really relevant for our purposes. German is an example of a language with four cases: nominative, accusative, genitive, which marks possession, and dative, which is for indirect objects. Turkish has all four of those, plus locative, which relates to location, and ablative, which indicates movement. Another one that shows up sometimes is instrumental. For example, in the sentence, I opened the door with a key, the key would take the instrumental case in a language that has that. And it doesn't stop there. Hungarian, for example, is notorious for having a lot of cases. But depending on how many cases there are in a language, they're not all equally likely to show up. For example, you're not likely to find dative in a language with no accusative case, you're not likely to find ablative or instrumental in a language with no dative, and you're not likely to find some of the rarer Hungarian cases, like temporal, unless the language has a huge number of cases. Since Czech has vocative, it almost certainly has at least 4 or 5 others that I haven't seen yet. This is another place where I feel like the Duolingo method is not likely to be very effective. I think it's safe to say without bragging that I know more about topics like this than the average Duolingo user. I don't mean to sound arrogant at all, it's just that I've taken graduate level courses in morphology, syntax, and language typology, and I'm able to apply what I learned in those classes to figuring out what Duolingo is giving me. Even so, while I've figured out that Czech has case, and when to use the two that it's taught me so far, I'm still working on figuring out what the rules are for how to form those cases. There's definitely also a number and gender distinction, but I think there's more going on than that as well, because otherwise I'm not sure why, for example, these two men's names don't have the same ending in vocative case. Part of the challenge that I set for myself was to use only Duolingo for a while to see what its strengths and weaknesses are and where the gaps are in what it can teach you. Morphology is one of the major ones, so my recommendation would be to use a grammar book alongside Duolingo. I'll definitely be doing that once I'm done with my little experiment. On the other hand, I'm actually pretty impressed with how things are going with sentence structure and word order. I feel like this is much easier to learn from Duolingo. I've learned that Czech word order is more flexible than English, which isn't surprising given that it has case morphology. But the basic word order seems to be subject, verb, object, and I've also learned that adjectives come before nouns, how to form a question, that subject pronouns can be dropped, and so on. I will say, syntax is my favorite subfield of linguistics, so this is probably partly to do with my own personal strengths and preferences, but even with that being the case, I do think that the Duolingo method is pretty effective at showing sentence structure and word order. You see so many example sentences that you start to get a feel for it and notice the patterns. Though for this as well, I definitely plan on checking a grammar book to make sure that my assumptions are correct.